quietly or there will be trouble.
Of course, machines can't think as people do. The machine is different.
Being, what marvelous being! How gratifying! How gratifying!
This person was consumed by passion and consumed by a compulsion. He seemed to not be in charge of what he was doing. He couldn't control himself. I mean, that's what struck me about it, is he had no control over what he was doing. He couldn't even sort out the different feelings he had about it. Couldn't even, I don't think, explain in any coherent way what his motivation was. It jumped all over the place, from him being a superhero, to him protector of the bears, to being an actor in some sort of a movie or something like that, to being a great, I don't know, demigod almost. And so one of the things I want to tell people a little bit about is my own journey. Not exactly a journey, but how people think about science, about how they can be passionate about something as far as their motivation, and yet try to be dispassionate about the way they look at the natural world. And so the one thing that I have that I think that this person, Timothy Treadwell, or whatever his real name was curiosity about the world. He was very curious, and I think we're all curious. I hope we are, but one thing I notice in people is that by the time they get to be in their 20s, much of the time the curiosity has been beaten out of them. Maybe self-inflicted beatings or something like that. I deal with young people all the time, and older people, and I find that much of the time they aren't curious about much at all. And it's really quite striking. When you ask them questions and ask them to discuss things about life that they've noticed or observed, it's very difficult much of the time to engage them in any conversation at all about anything outside very narrow, constricted borders that they're very familiar with, whether it's video games or music or something like that. I've been curious all my life, and I started out curious, and it was obvious that all I can do is ask questions. Anybody that knows me well knows that that's defines me as a person. That's what I like to do. And what I find is that most people don't like questions. Most people want things to be constricted, narrowed down, and well understood. And if you ask them things like, I don't know, ask me a question about something, or what do you have questions about? Much of the time, they have no questions at all. And I find this all the time in class, in conversations with people, even when sometimes I have this radio show called STEM Spots, you may have heard, even in conversations with people, sometimes I have to tell them, okay, why don't you talk about this, when I just ask them and open it up for them to talk. Much of the time they can't discuss what it is that they actually do for a living sometimes. It's quite interesting. So the one thing I want to do is I want to strike out, and I want to ask you guys if any of you could talk about the things you're truly curious about, and then the things you're truly passionate about, whether they're connected to the natural world in some way that you would call science, or they're connected to the artistic world, which I think a lot of this was about. I think this was a person who, according to somebody, was supposed to be the bartender in Cheers, and instead ended up making his own multiple 100-hour-long documentary about himself at some level. So is anybody willing to share? Is anybody willing to say what it is that they're truly curious about, what motivates them in a way that could be about the natural world or anything else? Anybody ever question things, think about things? Anybody willing to say anything at all about themselves? Let me ask, does anybody work in the sciences in what would be defined as the sciences in any particular way? Include math, computer science, physics, astronomy, biology, or anything associated with that, health sciences, medical profession? Anything? No? How about, like what?
I'm an arborist.
You're an arborist. Very good. I need an arborist because my black walnut tree has these weird mauve-y things or something hanging off of them. So see, there you go. So let me ask you this. Why would you get into something like that? Were you curious about trees? Was it accidental?
I went to Missouri State. I have a degree in wildlife conservation. Mm-hmm. So
you naturally fell into
that.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest that you might want to read on a conversation like that. There's a guy named G.H. Hardy, who was a mathematician, an English mathematician, who wrote a book called A Mathematician's Apology. If you're interested in stuff like that, you might want to read it. It's a short volume he wrote towards the end of his life where he talked about what motivated him to be a mathematician, because he was a very great mathematician. He actually discovered Ramanujan, who was an Indian mathematician who was a prodigy. He helped discover that person. And he wrote about what made people do the things they do, because it's quite interesting when you think about it. Can anybody in here articulate why they ended up doing what they did? Effectively articulate it. Whatever it is that you do, either for a living or as a passion, is anybody willing to say how they got to that point? Anybody? Could you effectively say I got from point A to point B through some volition of my own, or did you just accidentally stumble down a path, wake up one day and be doing whatever it is that you were doing? Nobody's good. Yeah.
Just kind of wander from
You wander?
subject to subject because it interests me. Like I had a fine arts degree and now I'm pursuing an engineering degree just because.
Really? Where are you doing the engineering degree at?
I'm doing prerequisites at OTC, but I have to transfer to all of them.
Good for you. What kind of engineer?
Chemical.
Okay, good.
But it's
Fine
just-
arts. And would you have stayed in fine arts? Was job security an issue at all? Was it you could do fine arts even if you're an engineer?
Oh, yeah.
That's the great thing about it. I tell students all the time that.
Oh, for certain.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still something I pursue
Right.
sort of as a hobby, but
Yeah.
it's in my spare time.
But it's kind of been a long journey of sort of a little bit of wandering, right?
Sure.
Yeah, see, I knew I wanted to be a nuclear engineer when I was 14. And I changed majors 3 weeks before 3 Mile Island, which was fortuitous in my own circumstances, to straight physics, which for some young people nowadays, when I say that in a class nowadays, then I have to explain what 3 Mile Island was. But for those in the audience, they know it was the worst nuclear disaster in American history, probably. But I always kind of knew. I kind of knew I was going to go into science in some way, shape, or form because that's just always what compelled me. How about anybody else? I mean, so this guy, he kind of wandered into this late in life. I mean, what was he? Probably he died. He was born. He's about 6 years old, and he'd be 60 right now, 60 something like that. No, he'd be about 62 actually. So kind of late in life, he sort of wandered into this. It kind of felt accidental, and then he seemed like he had found himself, or at least found a place where he could be somebody. So I want to just mention how many people feel like they're passionately connected with the world. Has anybody ever thought about this? You think about this kind of thing? See, scientists, you wouldn't think that we think about this. I think about it all the time. Does anybody feel like they're truly passionately connected to the world, or do you feel like you're getting from point A to point B and collecting a paycheck? Anybody got anything they want to say? Nobody's willing to. Do you want me to just lecture? I lecture all the time for a living, and it sucks. So you don't want me to do that. Nothing? How many people want to raise their hand and say they feel passionately connected to what's going on in the world around them? Okay? Share.
I got a grandchild. I'm pretty passionate.
Now there you go. There you go. Now, I mean, that's interesting because, you know, he obviously thought of the bears and especially the foxes as part of his family almost. It seemed like that was certainly some sort of a connection with the whole protector thing. Obviously, the bears needed very little protection. I don't know about the foxes. I suppose the foxes needed protection from the wolves. And the fish he didn't really seem to care about very much at all. And I've always found that interesting. The fish are always on the short end of the stick when it comes to your ranking of the species. Maybe insects are a little bit lower because the fish eat the insects. Anybody else? Anybody ever think about that? I mean, one thing I will say about science that I think is a negative. Many people perceive science as just this way that mankind is trying to tame the world. That was a lot of the part of the song at the end. Right? They talked about basically you got asphalt, you got streets, you got all this stuff, but you don't have this visceral connection anymore to the world. And science is trying to take that away from us. Does anybody feel like that's true at some level? That's the primary job of science is just to take away our natural connection to the world that we live in? Everybody think about that at all? Or is it just that science gives us this? It's pretty fancy. No? How about back in the back? You got anything for me? Huh?
Not really.
Really?
I don't think science is really trying to take anything away from us. I think in some ways maybe, but I think for the most part is trying to connect us more. Like with what kind of he was trying to do with making, people more aware about animals and, their habitat and maybe, humanity kind of coming in and trying to take over.
So you think his motivations might have been reasonably pure then maybe at some level?
Yeah, maybe, but, even though he wasn't a real scientist, I think, like with why we study the earth and different things is so we can become more connected to it and more understanding
Sure.
and hopefully want to preserve it.
You know, that is interesting at some level. He obviously wanted to matter. Would everybody agree that at some level, from everything he said, it's clear that he wanted to matter in some way, shape, or form? I mean, it seemed to me. And people would think that's not true of scientists, but scientists are motivated by the same drives and ambitions that anybody else is, whatever it is they do. So, I mean, we read this all the time, and half the stuff you see on the internet or half the stuff you see about self-help books is about motivation to matter. Is it important to people in the room that you matter? I mean, where do you get that? You matter to your grandchild, and that's very important, obviously. You matter to your immediate family. Do you need to make a mark? Is it important to make a mark? What does that even mean? I don't know. He had a documentary made about him. Did he make a mark then? Does that mean that somehow he would have been happy? I read a comment that somebody had where they were talking to a novelist, and the novelist was a confirmed non-believer of any kind and did not believe in an afterlife in any way, shape, or form. And yet the conversation took the tenor that if the novelist was sure that people would be reading his books 100 years after he was dead, then he would know it was all worthwhile, which is kind of an interesting take on things. Do we sometimes feel that? Because scientists feel the same way. I mean, they don't talk about it and they don't mention it, but sometimes they let their own ego and their own concerns get embroiled in what it is they're doing, and they hope against hope that what they're doing is more important than just one journal article and one journal on a shelf of books somewhere in the back of a dusty library, or conceivably buried on the internet somewhere with an H factor that's much less than it should be, or something like that. How about people in the room? Just do what you do. Are you doing something that you think matters? Do you feel like it could matter?
Eventually.
Eventually. Okay. Is it important that it does?
Well, I'm in engineering, so
Good.
I hope that it matters.
All right.
I tell myself that it matters. Whether it actually has meaning or value to society is debatable.
Right. You know, the thing about it is, how much of this footage would he have made into a film? He obviously would have edited that down just from the profanities he needs to show it to school children. So from that alone, he had to edit it down to probably a 50th of how long the actual footage was. And so to me, it seemed like a lot of this is he was documenting to himself that he existed. I mean, that's how I felt about it. People have said that marriage sometimes is your need to have a witness to your life. Has anybody ever heard that said, that people marry so that they have a witness to their own existence? And I think at some level that might be true. And scientists feel the same way. People might say, well, why are you in this? They're motivated by the same kinds of things. The main difference that I see between what a person in the lab or a person who's a biologist, an official biologist is that they try to maintain a disconnect between themselves and whatever it is they're studying. The one thing that's made me think about quite a bit was this whole idea of quantum mechanics and the whole idea of whether or not you can detach yourself from the experiment that you're conducting. Because in a quantum mechanical system, for example, it isn't clear that you can always disconnect the observing system from the system itself. In other words, you might have a laser that's going to help you observe something, but the laser might actually stimulate the thing that you're trying to observe, in which case it's going to tweak it, and you're not going to actually see what was there, but instead you're going to see what you put there. And so at some level, you try to minimize that to the very best of your ability. Obviously, to me, in this particular case, he was putting himself to maximize that. He was taking what it was he was trying to study, purportedly the bears, and he was making it as much about his interactions with the bears as it was about the bears themselves. Now, in science, you would try to do exactly the opposite. You would try to minimize your impact on the system, keep yourself as distant from it as you conceivably could, and try to look at it as if you weren't there, which of course is impossible, but you're trying to pull that off. Does anybody read about science, interested in science? Does anybody pay attention to science in the everyday world? Let's talk politics. So if we talk politics, one of the things I'm struck by is how people like big picture. They like big ideas. They like slogans, whether it's hope and change or whether it's anything that might be coming down the pike recently. We'll make ourselves great again, fill in the blank, whatever it is you want. And what people don't like, if the people really liked people to provide details, then the politicians would indeed provide details. But you must notice that people aren't clamoring for details. Most of the time they're clamoring for red meat, or blue meat, whichever kind of meat you want, it doesn't really matter, but they're clamoring for meat that's going to make them feel enthused. And in that particular case, in this guy's particular case, I feel like he was trying to provide that. He was trying to provide not scientific detail. If you go read an article about bears written by a field biologist, what you're going to see is, detailed charts and maps that might show their migratory patterns and their food consumption and different ways they interact with each other and all kinds of stuff. But what you're not going to see is him petting them on the head or something like that and telling the bear that I'm tough and you're tough and we're both tough and we're trying to take care of the world. And so most people don't read biological field articles about bears and their migratory habits. What they read and what they do is they watch this guy's shows because that makes them happy. So the one thing about science that I find the biggest disconnect is that the details, the devil's in the details. So for example, when you think about anything from getting energy independence in this country, to whether fracking's good or whether it's not good, to whether solar power is actually something that's viable in a long-term economic interest, to whether nuclear power can be made safe again, fill in the blank, it doesn't particularly matter, to global warming concerns, to any other number of things. It's only in the details that the solutions lie. That's where that's where the solution is. That's where the truth is. And as long as people are only talking about the big picture ideas, which are like people are trying to kill the bears and I'm trying to protect them and I'm a superhero and other people are bad, that to me represents the entire top-down view that most people have about science. Most people think, it's these big ideas. Man can't be responsible for global warming. What do you want to go into and do 10 years worth of research and look into the details and see whether or not that can be substantiated? No, not necessarily. Or we can't, fracking's bad, or fracking's good, or whatever it is you want. It's only when you study details in science that you can find whatever it is that's called the truth. Not much truth in there, a lot of opinion, but a lot of insight. And that's the one thing that struck me most about this guy. This guy reminds me so much of my second son. He's 30 years old now, and he has this grandiose, over-the-top approach to everything he's ever done. It's always the biggest, and the best, and the most amazing thing. And then when you try to bring him back to reality and fill in some of the details, the details are never forthcoming, ever. It's always going to be great. And you just hope that it doesn't just go terribly, terribly wrong. And the number of messes, I should make a movie about it. I've thought about it before. He's not even compared to one of my others. So that's the takeaway point for me. The takeaway point for me is that science ultimately is about the details. If you are just talking about the big ideas, you're not a scientist. The only way you can truly be a scientist is to get in, up to your arms, all the way in, not just massage the poop at the end there, whole hog, go into the poop, and actually try to get down and bore into the details. I've got one of my students over here, and he's learning. I hope that even as boring as it may seem sometimes, the only way you'll ever truly learn anything and feel like you truly are gaining some insight to it is to dig as deep into it as you can. That's it. That's the only way. Otherwise, what you're doing can't be science. Not really. It can be opinion. It can be many other things. So, does anybody want to say anything about you? You like them? I thought it was fascinating. Crazy fascinating for me. Anybody like, dislike? What do you think? Okay?
But he imprinted on all them animals that he was around, and he put human contact.
Yes.
So they'll have less fear of man, and somebody coming up to them with a gun where they might go away will end up killing them.
That's a good chance. That was what the one particular native from there said, that he was habituating them, and that's one thing that they never tried to do. Yeah, and that's a good point. He had preconceived notions about them. I should have mentioned that. Scientists are never supposed to have preconceived notions about anything, ever. When you have preconceived notions, then you're leading yourself down a path, and you're never supposed to do that. And it's obvious from his interaction with his squirrel friend when he was young and with his stuffed animals that he already had an idea of what it should be like, and it turned into this great and amazing journey for him for a while. But yeah, that's a good point. Anybody else? Anybody? Yeah.
I kind of think Herzog was more of a scientist.
Certainly he had more of a negative scientific attitude, that's for sure.
But yeah, he was studying treadwell in a very scientific way, I thought.
I agree. I mean, in this whole idea that, what would you call it, some sort of an analysis of a not a sociopathic, but certainly a psychological study of some kind or another, is that what you'd say?
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. Herzog's a very interesting person. How many people have ever seen any Herzog films? Some crazy stuff. He's done some crazy stuff, and he worked with Klaus Kinski, who was insane, or purportedly insane. So, yeah. So he would be a person that would certainly be capable of doing something like that. Yeah, it's a good point. Anybody else? Well, I don't know. I'd hope that it would just be wild with conversation, that people would be just, they hate science. How many people love science? Do you love it? You shouldn't love it because it's an inanimate object. It doesn't have, it's not going to love you back. It will do what it's going to do. But I'm passionately in love with ideas. And it drives most people I know crazy. So I think probably we'll call it good, unless people want to say something else. No. I hope you'll attend next week. I'm not sure what's the movie next week. I'm not positive. Does anybody know? Huh? Gattaca, which would be Paul Durham's going to talk about genetic work. Paul Durham's a biologist from Missouri State. He'll talk about that. And then Ordinary People, I think it's the last one. I'm going to talk about psychology. That's I haven't seen that since it came out, so I might come back to that. Well, thanks very much for coming by. Have a good rest of your evening. Go watch some more Herzog. I think he did Nosferatu the Vampire, but I'm not positive he did that.
Yeah.
So, did he?
Yeah, he did the remake.
Yeah. With Kinski. Yeah, I like it. Very good. Okay.